The tractor was the last machine left in the orchard auction. Most buyers had already moved toward the smaller tools and wagons near the barn. No one seemed interested in the faded red machine sitting beneath the apple trees. A sign hung from its steering wheel. New parts, still won't run. Luke Bennett stopped beside it. The tractor looked worn but not abandoned. The spark plugs were new. So were the ignition wires. Fresh bolts held the carburetor against the intake manifold, and clean marks around the distributor showed that someone had removed it recently. Someone had spent money trying to make the engine run. They had failed. Dean Mercer, owner of the local equipment dealership, stood near the front wheel. "I would stay away from that one," he said. Luke looked under the hood. What happened? Owner replaced the carburetor, plugs, wires, and distributor cap. Still nothing. Does the engine turn? Strongly. Compression? Feels good enough? Spark? Plenty. Luke looked at him. Then why doesn't it run? Dean shrugged. Could be a bent valve, could be the cam timing, could be something worse. A worker connected a battery and climbed onto the tractor. Dean waved several people back. Listen. The starter engaged. The engine turned quickly and evenly. Luke heard 4 clear compression strokes. Then a sharp explosion burst through the carburetor. A small flame flashed inside the open intake before disappearing. Several people laughed. Same thing every time, Dean said. Cranks, backfires, and floods itself. The worker released the starter. The engine stopped. Luke remained beside the hood. The sound bothered him, not because it sounded destructive, because it sounded organized. The starter had turned the engine at a steady speed. There had been no heavy knock, no grinding, and no sudden stop. The backfire had occurred only after several complete rotations. That meant fuel was entering the cylinders, a spark was present, and at least one cylinder had enough compression to ignite the mixture. The problem was not that the engine could not fire, it was firing when an intake valve was open. Luke leaned closer to the distributor. The mounting bolts showed fresh wrench marks. The distributor body had also been rotated far from the old stain on the engine block. Someone had changed its position. He followed the plug wires around the cap. One wire crossed beneath another. Their arrangement did not match the firing order numbers cast into the side of the engine. Who installed the distributor? Luke asked. Dean folded his arms. The owner's nephew. Then one of my men checked it. Did he find top dead center? Yes. On the compression stroke? Dean looked at him. Top dead center is top dead center. Luke said nothing. In a 4-stroke engine, the number 1 piston reached the top twice. Once after compressing the fuel mixture, and once after pushing exhaust from the cylinder. The pulley mark looked the same both times, but only one position was correct for ignition. If the distributor had been installed while the piston was finishing its exhaust stroke, the spark would arrive half a cycle too early. The engine could have fuel, spark, compression, new parts, and still never run. Dean pointed toward the intake. You heard the backfire. That could be a valve problem. It could. Then why are you still looking at it? Because the backfire is coming through the carburetor. So? Luke pointed toward the distributor. So the spark may be arriving while the intake valve is still open. Dean gave a short laugh. You think 2 repair attempts missed something that simple? I think someone moved the distributor. That doesn't prove it is wrong. No. Luke looked at the fresh tool marks again. But it gives me a place to check. His mother Anna approached from the auction office. You found something? I found a question. She studied the tractor. We came for a spray pump drive. This tractor has the right power takeoff. It also has a sign saying it does not run. Luke looked toward the orchard beyond the auction yard. Their own tractor was sitting at home with a damaged transmission. Without another machine, they could not operate the sprayer through every row of apple trees. The first signs of leaf-eating insects had already appeared in the northern block. They had only a few days before the damage spread. Anna lowered her voice. Do not buy it because you want to prove those men wrong. I don't? Then why are you interested? Luke looked back at the tractor. Because all the parts they replaced appear to be working. That sounds like a reason not to buy it. Unless they are working at the wrong time. The auctioneer called for bidders to gather. A loader began pulling the tractor toward the center of the yard. As the old machine rolled past him, Luke saw the timing mark on the crankshaft pulley. It had been painted white. Someone had carefully aligned it. They had simply never proved which stroke the engine was on when they did it. The crowd saw a tractor that had defeated every repair. Luke saw an engine whose fuel, spark, and compression had never met at the same moment. 3 days before the auction, Luke found the first damaged leaves in the northern orchard. Small holes marked the fresh growth. Several young apples had dark scars where insects had fed near the stems. He carried one branch to the equipment shed. Anna examined it beneath the work light. "How bad?" "Not yet." Luke pointed to the curled leaves. "But it is spreading." The Bennett orchard covered 26 acres. Most of the trees stood on narrow rows along the hillside, where large equipment could not turn easily. Their old tractor had been built for that work. It was small enough to pass between the trees and strong enough to power the orchard sprayer. Now it sat behind the barn with its transmission opened. A broken gear had damaged the housing, and replacement parts would not arrive for at least 2 weeks. The orchard could not wait that long. Luke connected the sprayer to the tractor one more time and started the engine. The motor ran, but the transmission would not hold gear. When he released the clutch, a grinding sound came from beneath the seat. The tractor moved less than 6 feet before the rear wheels stopped pulling. Luke shut it down. Anna stood beside the sprayer tank. "Can you repair it temporarily?" "Not safely." "What about using the pickup?" "The pump needs steady power from a PTO shaft." The orchard sprayer held 200 gallons. Its pump had to maintain constant pressure while the tractor moved between the rows. A pickup could pull the tank. It could not power the system. Luke called the nearest equipment rental yard. Every suitable tractor was already reserved for spring fieldwork. A neighboring farmer offered to help, but his machine was too wide for the older orchard rows. The local dealer could provide a compact tractor for 3 days. The price was more than the Bennetts expected to earn from an entire block of early apples. That evening, Luke and Anna walked through the northern trees. The insect damage had reached the next row. Luke stopped near a young tree planted by his grandfather. Its leaves had been eaten along the edges. "If we lose too much leaf growth now, the fruit will stay small," he said. "And if we wait, the damage spreads before we can treat the rest." Anna looked toward the broken tractor near the barn. "How much time?" 4 days, maybe 5. After that, even spraying would not restore the leaves already lost. The next morning, Luke removed the sprayer's pump cover. The shaft turned freely. The hoses were sound. The machine itself was ready. They only lacked something to power it. He checked classified advertisements, farm notices, and local equipment yards. Every running tractor cost more than they could afford. One listing mentioned an orchard liquidation 2 towns away. The equipment list included carts, pruning tools, storage bins, and one non-running tractor. Anna read the description. "New parts, still won't run. Someone already spent money on it," Luke said. "And failed. Maybe." She looked at him. That word usually becomes expensive. They drove to the auction only to inspect the sprayer equipment. Luke had not planned to bid on the tractor. Then he heard it backfire. He heard the starter turn evenly. He saw fresh ignition parts and tool marks around the distributor. Most importantly, he noticed the engine was producing everything it needed to run, just not in the correct sequence. Back at the auction yard, Anna watched the tractor being pulled toward the bidding area. "How much money do you have?" she asked. $480. That includes the money for replacement transmission parts." "Yes, if you spend it here and the tractor does not run, we lose both options." Luke knew. They would have no repaired tractor, no replacement machine, and no money to hire one. Anna studied his face. "What do you actually know?" "The engine turns evenly. That is one thing. It has compression. The plugs are firing. Fuel is reaching the cylinders. And what are you guessing? That the distributor is installed on the wrong stroke. Can you prove it before buying?" "Not without opening it." She looked toward the waiting crowd. "Then do not bid on confidence." Luke met her eyes. "Bid on evidence." He repeated the facts silently. New parts, strong cranking, wet plugs, a clean spark, backfire through the intake, fresh marks around the distributor. None proved the tractor would run. Together, they pointed toward timing. The auctioneer lifted his microphone. The orchard needed a tractor within days. The machine in front of Luke might be their only affordable option, but if his diagnosis was wrong, the insects would keep moving while their savings disappeared into another broken engine. Before the bidding started, Luke returned to the red tractor with a small tool bag. He began with the engine oil. The level was low but still safe. The oil was dark, yet there was no milky color that would suggest coolant had entered the crankcase. He turned the engine by hand. Each cylinder created clear resistance. The crankshaft moved smoothly between compression strokes, with no sudden stop or metallic scrape. Then Luke removed the spark plugs. All four were wet with gasoline. Fuel was reaching the cylinders. He connected one plug to its wire, grounded the metal body against the engine, and asked an auction worker to turn the starter. A strong blue spark jumped across the gap. Luke tested the other three wires. All of them sparked: fuel, compression, ignition. The engine had the three things it needed. But when the worker tried starting it again, a sharp explosion came through the carburetor. A brief flame flashed inside the intake. Luke raised one hand. "Stop." The starter fell silent. Dean Mercer stood nearby with several farmers. "You heard it," Dean said. "Intake valve problem." "Maybe," Luke replied. He removed the distributor cap. The rotor sat beneath it, pointing toward the rear of the engine. Luke followed the number 1 plug wire from the first cylinder back to the cap. It connected at the front. The rotor was nowhere near it. He checked the remaining wires. Their order around the cap did not match the firing sequence cast into the engine block. "Those wires are wrong," Luke said. Dean stepped closer. "They were moved during testing. That could cause the backfire. It did the same thing before." Luke studied the distributor body. Fresh wrench marks surrounded the mounting clamp. A white paint line had been drawn across the crankshaft pulley, marking top dead center. Someone had clearly attempted to set the timing, but the mark alone did not show whether the number 1 piston was finishing its compression stroke or its exhaust stroke. The piston reached the top in both cases. Only one was correct for ignition. Luke removed the number 1 spark plug again. He placed his finger lightly over the opening, turned the engine slowly. The worker pressed the starter in short bursts. The pulley mark approached top dead center. Luke felt no pressure against his finger. He looked at the open distributor. The rotor pointed near the number 1 wire position. "That is the exhaust stroke," he said. Dean frowned. "You cannot know that from one turn." "I know because the cylinder did not push air out," Luke asked the worker to continue. The crankshaft made one complete revolution. As the timing mark approached the same position again, pressure built beneath Luke's finger. Air pushed firmly from the spark plug hole. He raised his hand. "Stop." This time, the number 1 piston was at the top of its compression stroke. Luke looked at the rotor. It pointed almost directly opposite the number 1 terminal. The distributor was installed half a cycle out of position. Mr. Avery, an older mechanic standing at the edge of the group, leaned closer. 180 degrees, he said. Dean examined the rotor himself. That would explain the intake backfire. Luke nodded. The spark is arriving when the cylinder is finishing the wrong stroke. A farmer behind them asked, "So the engine is good?" Luke shook his head. "This proves the ignition is wrong. It does not prove everything else is good. The valves could still leak. The carburetor could be adjusted badly. The cooling system and transmission remained unknown. But the engine had not defeated every repair. Someone had set the timing by the mark, without checking what the piston was doing." Dean pointed toward the distributor. "You still have to remove and reset it, or rearrange the wires correctly if the drive position allows it. And if you make a mistake, it may backfire again." Luke replaced the cap without changing anything. The tractor did not belong to him yet. He had learned enough. The engine had compression, the plugs had spark, the carburetor supplied fuel, and the backfire was not proof of internal destruction. It was evidence that those three things were meeting at the wrong moment. The auction bell rang near the barn. Buyers began moving toward the tractor. Anna joined Luke beside the front wheel. "What did you find?" "The distributor is installed on the exhaust stroke. Can you fix it?" "I know how to correct the firing position." "That was not my question." Luke looked at the faded machine. He could correct the timing. He could not yet know what would happen after the engine started. "It gives the tractor a real chance," he said. Anna glanced toward the crowd. "And if the bidding rises?" "We stop at the limit." She studied him for a moment. "Good." The loader pulled the tractor into the center of the yard. As the sign swung beneath the steering wheel, Luke read it again. "New parts, still won't run." The parts were not the mystery anymore. The order was. The red tractor was pulled into the center of the auction yard, just after noon. Its front tires dragged slightly as the loader positioned it beneath the old apple trees. The faded sign on the steering wheel moved in the wind. New parts. Still won't run. Ray Dalton, the auctioneer, climbed onto a wooden platform and lifted his microphone. Next lot is the 4-cylinder orchard tractor. Gasoline engine. New carburetor, plugs, wires, and distributor parts. He paused and looked at the condition sheet. Still does not run. Sold as is. No guarantee. Someone near the barn called out, "At least the new parts are worth something." Several men laughed. Carl Voss, a parts buyer wearing a grease-stained cap, walked around the machine. He checked the rear tires, the generator, and the nearly new carburetor. He did not care whether the engine started. He planned to take the useful pieces and sell the rest by weight. Ray opened the bidding. "Who will give me $800? No hands moved. 600? Silence. 400? Carl raised 2 fingers. 200. Ray pointed toward him. "I have 200. Looking for 250. Luke lifted his bidder card. 250. The people around him turned. A few recognized him from the inspection earlier. Others saw only a 17-year-old boy standing beside his mother. Carl looked back and smiled. 300. Luke raised the card again. 325. The laughter began. Dean Mercer stood near the tractor with his arms folded. "Luke," he called, "you understand that timing may not be the only problem." "I understand." "Then why are you bidding like you already fixed it?" Luke did not answer. Ray continued. 325. Do I hear 350? Carl lifted his hand. 350. Anna leaned closer to Luke. What is your limit? 400. You have 480. I need the rest for oil, fuel, and parts. And if the engine has internal damage, then we stop. Anna looked toward the orchard beyond the yard. No. If the engine has internal damage, the money is already gone. Luke knew she was right. Every bid carried more than financial risk. Their own tractor still needed transmission parts. The orchard insects were moving from row to row. If this machine failed, they might lose both their repair money and the chance to protect the crop. Ray raised the gavel. $350? Going once. Luke looked at the red tractor. He repeated the evidence in his mind. The engine turned evenly. Each cylinder built resistance. The plugs were wet with fuel. Every wire produced a strong spark. The distributor had been installed on the wrong stroke. Those facts did not prove the tractor was healthy, but they explained why it had never started after the new parts were installed. Going twice, Ray called. Luke raised his card. 375. Carl's smile disappeared. He turned back toward the tractor and studied the parts again. At 375, there was still profit in the carburetor, generator, tires, and sheet metal, but not much. 400, Carl said. That was Luke's limit. Ray pointed toward him. $400, looking for 425. Luke stayed still. Anna watched him carefully. The crowd waited. Carl folded his arms, certain the boy would stop. Ray raised the gavel. 400. Going once. Luke could walk away. He could keep the money for their broken tractor. He could tell himself the orchard machine had too many unknowns. Then he remembered the flame through the carburetor, the rotor pointing in the wrong direction, the pressure at the number 1 cylinder appearing one full crankshaft revolution after the distributor reached its firing position. The engine had not been refusing to run. It had been commanded to fire on the wrong stroke. 425, Luke said. Anna turned toward him. That is above the limit. I know. You will have $55 left. I know. Ray repeated the bid. 425 from bidder 31. Carl stared at Luke. Then he walked to the tractor and checked the carburetor once more. He looked at the rear tires and generator. 450. Luke felt his stomach tighten. That left $30. Not enough for a battery. Not enough for a full service. Barely enough for fuel and a few basic supplies. Anna spoke quietly. Buy the evidence, not the hope. Luke looked at her. The evidence has not changed. The price has. Ray lifted the microphone. 450. Looking for 475. Luke lowered his bidder card. Carl smiled again. Ray raised the gavel. 450. Going once. Luke watched the tractor. Carl would not repair it. He would remove the new parts that made the machine look valuable and cut the rest apart. By the next morning, the timing mistake might no longer matter. Going twice. Luke raised the card. 475. The crowd reacted immediately. Someone near the loader laughed. He's spending everything on a tractor the dealer couldn't fix. Another man called out, make sure he buys a trailer too. Luke kept his eyes on Ray. Carl looked at the tractor, then at Luke. At $500, his profit would become uncertain. He shook his head. I'm out. Ray scanned the yard. $475. Anyone at 500? No one moved. Dean said nothing. Mr. Avery watched Luke with a serious expression. Anna stood beside her son without touching his arm. The decision had already been made. Ray raised the gavel. 475 going once. Luke felt every dollar he had earned leave his hands before he had even paid. Going twice. The gavel struck. Sold. A wave of laughter and scattered applause moved through the crowd. Carl walked past Luke. You paid running tractor money for a parts machine. Luke looked toward the faded sign. Not where I come from. Inside the auction office, he counted out the bills. The clerk handed him a sale document. Sold, as is. No warranty. No refund. Luke signed. When he returned outside, Ray was waiting beside the tractor. You have until sunset to remove it. Anna looked toward their pickup. They had no trailer large enough to haul the machine. How much for delivery? She asked. Ray named a price higher than the $5 Luke had left. Luke glanced toward the western horizon. The sun was still above the trees, but it had already begun its descent. How long exactly? He asked. Ray checked his watch. 3 hours. Dean gave a short laugh. You think you can correct the ignition, repair everything else, and drive it out before dark? No. Luke placed his toolbox beside the front wheel. I think I can correct the ignition and learn what everything else needs. People who had started walking toward the next auction lot slowed down. Carl stopped beside his truck. Dean remained near the tractor. They wanted to see whether the boy had bought a machine or a lesson. Anna looked at Luke. Do not rush because they are watching. I won't. Then what comes first? Luke opened the hood and pointed toward the distributor. We put the engine on the correct stroke. He had 3 hours. $5. And a crowd that had already decided how the story would end. Luke began with the number 1 cylinder. He removed the spark plug and placed one finger lightly over the opening. Turn the engine in short bursts, he told the auction worker. The starter engaged, the crankshaft moved. On the first approach to the timing mark, Luke felt almost no pressure. Stop. He checked the pulley. The white mark was aligned with top dead center, but the cylinder had not compressed air. That meant the piston was finishing the exhaust stroke. Luke marked the position with chalk, then asked the worker to continue. The engine turned one complete revolution. This time, pressure built beneath Luke's finger and pushed it away from the opening. Stop there. The same timing mark had returned, but now the number 1 piston was at the top of the compression stroke. Luke removed the distributor cap. The rotor pointed almost directly away from the number 1 terminal. Mr. Avery leaned over the fender. There it is. Dean Mercer stepped closer. Distributor is half a turn out. Luke nodded. The engine had been timed at top dead center, just the wrong top dead center. He marked the distributor body and the engine block before loosening the clamp. If anything went wrong, he would still know the original position. Then he checked the firing order cast into the side of the block. 1, 3, 4, 2. The rotor turned clockwise. Luke traced each wire around the cap. 2 had been crossed. Even after correcting the distributor position, the engine would still fire out of sequence unless the wires were arranged properly. Carl Voss stood near his truck. So the dealer missed 2 mistakes? Dean ignored him. Luke removed the distributor carefully. He rotated the shaft half a turn and reinstalled it with the number 1 piston still at the top of its compression stroke. The drive gear resisted. He lifted it slightly, turned the oil pump slot with a screwdriver, then lowered the distributor again. This time it seated fully. The rotor pointed toward the number 1 terminal. Luke tightened the clamp only enough to hold the body while still allowing small timing adjustments. Then he rearranged the plug wires in the correct firing order. Anna watched the sun lowering behind the orchard. 2 hours, she said. Luke reinstalled the spark plug. Before attempting to start the engine, he checked the carburetor. Gasoline filled the bowl. Too much of it. A damp line had formed beneath the intake, and the sharp smell of fuel hung around the engine. The repeated starting attempts had flooded the cylinders. Luke removed the plugs again. All four were wet. "If you try it now, it may still backfire," Mr. Avery said. Luke nodded. He dried the plugs with a clean rag and left the cylinders open for several minutes so the excess fuel could evaporate. Then he inspected the choke linkage. The control lever inside the operator's area appeared open. At the carburetor, however, the choke plate remained nearly closed. A bent rod had jammed the mechanism. The engine had been receiving too much fuel during every attempt. Luke freed the linkage and adjusted the rod until the plate moved through its full range. Open, half choke, closed. He returned it to the starting position. Dean looked into the intake. That alone could keep it from starting. "Yes. You still think timing was the main problem?" Luke held up one of the wet plugs. "The choke explains the flooding." Then he pointed toward the distributor. "It does not explain why the flame came backward through the carburetor." The crowd had grown quieter. They had watched Luke find one mistake, then another. Neither required a new part. Both had been created during earlier repairs. Luke installed the dry plugs and connected the wires. He checked the transmission. Neutral. He locked the brakes. Then he stood beside the distributor so he could adjust it while the engine turned. "Clear," he called. The worker pressed the starter. The engine rotated strongly. One cylinder fired, then another. The sound came from the exhaust this time, not the carburetor. Luke raised one hand. "Stop." The change was small, but everyone heard it. No explosion through the intake, no sudden flame. The engine had fired in the correct direction. Dean stepped closer. "Timing is closer. Not exact." Luke rotated the distributor body a few degrees. He asked for another attempt. The starter turned. The engine fired twice in sequence. Then it stopped. Luke adjusted the distributor slightly in the opposite direction. On the third attempt, the engine fired 3 times. The old tractor shook beneath the starter. A cloud of gray smoke rose from the exhaust. Then the engine died again. Someone in the crowd muttered, "It almost had it." Luke removed one plug. Wet again. The carburetor was still delivering too much fuel, even with the choke open. He checked the mixture screw. It had been turned far beyond a normal starting position. Someone had tried to solve the no-start problem by adding more fuel. Luke gently seated the screw, counting the turns. Almost 5. He reset it to a basic starting adjustment. Then he examined the float bowl. A slow drip continued beneath the carburetor. The float valve was not closing completely. He removed the bowl and found a small piece of dirt trapped beneath the needle. Luke cleaned the seat and tested the float. This time the fuel stopped when the float rose. He reassembled the carburetor. Anna checked the horizon. The sun had reached the tops of the western trees. 1 hour and 20 minutes. Luke dried the plugs again. His hands smelled of gasoline and his shirt was dark with sweat beneath the arms. Dean watched him work. "You found the distributor wrong. Crossed wires, a stuck choke, and a leaking float." Luke tightened the final plug. "All of them mattered. And if it still does not run, then we keep following what the engine tells us." He climbed onto the worn seat. The starter turned. The first cylinder fired, then the third. The fourth joined for 1 revolution. The engine almost caught. Luke moved the throttle slightly forward. The tractor shook hard. A thick cloud of gray smoke left the exhaust. For 2 seconds, the engine ran without the starter. Then it slowed and stopped. The yard became silent. Luke looked at the oil pressure gauge. The needle had moved slightly during those 2 seconds. The pump worked. The engine had fired in the correct order. The timing was close. The fuel mixture was improving. The tractor still was not running. But the laughter had stopped. The crowd had heard the difference between a machine firing at random and an engine trying to start. Luke looked toward the sinking sun. He had less than an hour and a half. The tractor had fuel, it had spark, it had compression. Now those 3 things were finally meeting on the correct stroke. He only needed them to meet at the correct moment, long enough for the engine to stay alive. The tractor had run for 2 seconds. That was enough to prove the firing order was correct. It was not enough to drive the machine out of the auction yard. Luke climbed down and opened the distributor cap again. The rotor still pointed toward the number 1 terminal, but the distributor body had shifted slightly during the last attempt. He had left the clamp loose enough for adjustment, and the engine's vibration had moved it. A few degrees could decide whether an old engine started or only coughed. Mr. Avery watched from the other side of the hood. "Set it before the battery gets weaker," he said. Luke looked at the starter battery. Each attempt turned the engine more slowly. He needed to stop guessing. Luke rotated the engine by hand until the number 1 piston approached the top of its compression stroke again. He confirmed the stroke by feeling pressure at the open spark plug hole. Then he aligned the pulley with the ignition mark located just before top dead center. The spark should occur slightly before the piston reached the top. That allowed the flame inside the cylinder time to spread as the piston began moving downward. Too early, and the engine could kick against the starter. Too late, and it might fire weakly without gaining speed. Luke removed the distributor cap and watched the points. As he turned the distributor body slowly, the contacts began to open. That was the moment the coil released its spark. He stopped moving the housing and tightened the clamp. Dean Mercer leaned closer. "You are setting it without a timing light? Static timing first. That only gets you close. Close is enough to start it." Luke checked the points again. They barely opened. The gap looked narrower than it should have been. A narrow point gap kept the ignition coil charging for too long and delayed the spark. It could still create a bright spark outside the engine, yet fail to produce reliable ignition under compression. Luke inserted a thin gauge between the contacts. Too tight. He loosened the adjustment screw and opened the points slightly. Then he rotated the engine again and measured them at the highest part of the distributor cam. The gauge passed through with a light drag. He tightened the screw. Dean watched silently. The distributor had been replaced, but no one had finished setting it correctly. Luke connected one plug to a wire and grounded it against the block. Turn it once. The starter engaged. A sharp, blue spark crossed the gap. Stronger than before, Luke installed the plug and checked the remaining wires. Anna looked toward the western trees. 45 minutes. Ray Dalton stood near the auction office. When the sun reaches the ridge, the tractor gets moved. Luke nodded. He checked the carburetor again. No fuel dripped from the bowl. The choke plate moved freely. The mixture screw remained at its basic setting. Then he examined the throttle linkage. The hand lever moved, but the carburetor arm returned almost completely to idle. A weak spring allowed the throttle plate to close farther than the control indicated. The engine had nearly started, then lost the air and fuel needed to continue. Luke shortened the linkage by one adjustment turn. Now the throttle remained slightly open. "Try it," Mr. Avery said. Luke climbed into the seat. Transmission in neutral. Brakes locked. Choke halfway closed. Throttle just above idle. He pressed the starter. The engine turned more slowly than before. One cylinder fired, then another. The tractor shook, but the engine did not catch. Luke released the starter. The battery was fading. Carl Voss laughed from beside his truck. "Sun may beat you after all." No one joined him. The crowd had already heard the engine run briefly. They were no longer waiting to see whether Luke had been wrong. They were waiting to see whether he could finish. Dean touched the battery cable. "It will not take many more attempts." Luke removed the number 1 plug. It was damp, but not soaked. The mixture was closer. He checked the plug gap and wiped the electrode clean. Then he inspected the distributor's small advance mechanism. The plate beneath the points should move as engine speed increased, allowing the spark timing to advance. Instead, the plate resisted and returned slowly. Old grease had hardened beneath it. That would not prevent the engine from starting, but it could cause the timing to remain unstable as the engine tried to gain speed. Luke cleaned the pivot and added 1 drop of oil. The plate moved freely. Mr. Avery nodded. "That matters after it catches." Luke replaced the cap. Anna approached him. "You have enough information now?" "To start it, yes." "That is not what I mean." Luke looked at the tractor. She was asking whether he knew when to stop. The starter was heating. The battery was nearly discharged. Repeated flooding could wash oil from the cylinder walls. Luke could not keep trying only because the crowd was watching. "One more controlled attempt," he said, "and if it fails, we recharge the battery and move the tractor another way." Ray heard him. "You cannot leave it here overnight." "I know." Luke looked toward their pickup. They had no trailer and almost no money. Failure would mean negotiating for a tow they could not afford. He returned to the seat. This time he left the choke open. The cylinders already held enough fuel. He pressed the starter. The engine rotated. Slowly. One cylinder fired. A second answered. Then the starter began losing speed. Luke moved the distributor body a fraction toward advance. The next ignition sounded stronger. The engine turned one full revolution without help. Then two. Luke released the starter. For 3 seconds, the tractor ran on its own. The exhaust released a thick gray cloud. The engine speed rose, fell, then rose again. Luke moved the throttle forward slightly. A fourth cylinder joined. The tractor shook so hard that dust fell from beneath the dashboard. Then the engine stopped. Silence returned. But this time the oil pressure needle had climbed halfway into the safe range before falling. Luke remained in the seat. The engine had stayed alive longer. The ignition timing was now close enough. The spark was strong. The fuel mixture was usable. Something smaller was preventing it from continuing. He looked at the fuel bowl. The level had fallen sharply during the brief run and was filling again very slowly. Luke climbed down and opened the tank cap. A faint hiss escaped. The vent hole in the cap was blocked. Fuel could enter the carburetor while the tractor sat still, but once the engine began using it, a vacuum formed inside the tank and restricted the flow. Luke removed the cap completely. The fuel bowl filled at once. Mr. Avery smiled. "There is the last piece." Luke looked toward the horizon. The sun had dropped behind the highest apple trees. Only a strip of orange light remained above the ridge. Ray raised one hand. 10 minutes. Luke returned to the seat. This time the tractor had the correct firing order. The correct stroke, the correct point gap, the correct mixture, and a fuel tank that could finally breathe. He placed his hand on the starter switch. The next attempt would decide whether the old machine left the auction yard under its own power or disappeared into darkness behind a loader. Luke left the fuel cap loose so air could enter the tank. Then he checked everything one final time. Transmission in neutral, brakes locked, throttle slightly open, choke off, plug wires in the correct firing order, distributor tightened close to the proper timing position. The orange light behind the orchard had nearly disappeared. Ray Dalton stood near the auction office with one hand on his watch. "Last attempt," he called. The crowd moved closer, but no one laughed now. They had watched Luke find the distributor installed on the wrong stroke. They had seen him correct the crossed wires, free the choke, clean the carburetor needle, adjust the points, and uncover the blocked fuel tank vent. The tractor had nearly started several times. Now there were no obvious problems left to blame. Luke placed his hand on the starter switch. Anna stood beside the rear wheel. "Do not force it," she said. "I won't." He pressed the starter. The engine turned slowly. The battery was weak from repeated attempts. One cylinder fired. Then the third. A heavy pulse shook the hood. The engine stopped firing for half a revolution, then caught again. Luke kept the starter engaged. Gray smoke pushed from the exhaust. The first cylinder fired once more. The third answered. Then the fourth joined. The engine began turning faster than the starter. Luke released the switch. For 1 second, the tractor ran on its own. Then the speed dropped. Luke moved the throttle forward slightly. The engine caught again. A deep explosion came from the exhaust, followed by another in the correct rhythm. The tractor shook violently as the last cylinder began firing. A thick cloud of gray smoke rose above the hood and drifted through the final strip of sunlight. The engine was running. Luke kept one hand near the throttle and watched the gauges. The oil pressure needle remained near zero. His excitement disappeared. "Come on," he whispered. The engine had been sitting for years. It could take several seconds for the oil pump to fill the passages, but Luke could not let it continue without pressure. He reached toward the ignition switch. Then the needle moved. Slowly it climbed out of the red zone. Mr. Avery saw it too. "Pressure is coming up." Luke allowed the engine to idle. The exhaust continued smoking, but the color began to lighten. The violent shaking became less severe as each cylinder cleared excess fuel. No flame came through the carburetor. No backfire struck the intake. The engine was finally firing in the correct order, on the correct stroke, at nearly the correct moment. Dean Mercer stepped closer to the hood. "Do not raise the speed yet." Luke nodded. He was listening for internal damage. No deep knock. No scraping metal, no sharp valve noise, only the rough rhythm of an old gasoline engine waking after years of failed repairs. The crowd stood completely silent. Carl Voss looked at the carburetor he had planned to remove and sell. Ray lowered his watch. The sun had touched the ridge. The tractor was running before sunset. Anna approached carefully. "You did it." Luke kept his eyes on the temperature gauge. "We started it. That is what I said. It still has to prove it can stay running." The engine missed once, then twice. Luke adjusted the distributor body only a fraction. The idle immediately became smoother. Dean noticed the change. "You were still slightly late." "Yes." Luke tightened the distributor clamp fully. The engine settled into a steady four-cylinder rhythm. The gray smoke faded until only a light haze remained above the exhaust. Ray stepped toward the tractor. What was the real problem? Luke looked at the engine. There wasn't one problem. He pointed beneath the distributor cap. It was timed on the exhaust stroke. Then, toward the plug wires. 2 wires were crossed. He touched the choke linkage. The choke was stuck. Finally, he looked at the fuel cap resting loosely on the tank, and the tank could not breathe. Ray shook his head. All that from parts someone had just replaced? The parts worked. Luke looked toward Dean. They just did not work together. Dean did not argue. He watched the engine for several seconds before speaking. "I aligned the pulley mark. You found top dead center." "Yes, but not the compression stroke." Dean glanced toward the crowd. Then he nodded once. "No." It was a quiet admission, but everyone heard it. Luke let the engine run for another minute. Oil pressure remained steady. The temperature needle moved upward but stayed within the safe range. A thin line of coolant appeared beneath the upper radiator hose. Luke shut the engine down immediately. The tractor stopped cleanly. The silence afterward felt different from every silence before it. The machine was no longer silent because it could not run. It was silent because Luke had chosen to stop it. Dean examined the hose. "Crack near the clamp. Can it be shortened? Probably." Ray looked toward the loader. "So it still cannot leave." Luke opened his toolbox. "It can." The crowd had watched the engine come alive. Now Luke had to repair the cooling leak, test the clutch, and find out whether the tractor could move before darkness covered the yard. But the hardest question had already been answered. Everyone had believed the tractor needed another new part. Luke had proven it only needed the existing parts to meet at the right moment. The engine had run. The tractor still had to leave the auction yard. Luke waited for the radiator to cool, then removed the upper hose. The rubber had split near the clamp, but the rest of it remained firm. He cut away the damaged section, cleaned the outlet, and reinstalled the shortened hose. It barely reached. Dean Mercer examined the repair. "It may hold for the trip. That is all I need." Luke refilled the radiator with water from the auction barn and tightened the cap loosely. If pressure built too quickly, the weakened hose could split again. Then he checked the engine oil. The level remained safe. Ray Dalton looked toward the darkening sky. "You have less than 30 minutes. Luke climbed into the seat and restarted the tractor. The engine caught faster this time. No backfire. No long cranking. It settled into a rough but steady idle. Luke pressed the clutch pedal. It moved halfway down, then stopped. He pushed harder. A dry creak came from beneath the platform. Dean looked at the linkage. Rust in the pivot. Luke shut the engine down and crawled beneath the tractor. The clutch rod was coated with dirt and hardened grease. The adjustment nut had also backed away, leaving too much free movement in the pedal. He cleaned the pivot, added oil, and worked the pedal repeatedly. The travel improved. Then he shortened the linkage until the release arm began moving earlier. Dean watched him test it. "Leave some free play." "I am." If the rod was adjusted too tightly, the release bearing could remain pressed against the clutch, even when the pedal was released. Luke tightened the lock nut and climbed back onto the seat. He started the engine again. Then he pressed the clutch and moved the gear lever toward first. The gears ground loudly. Luke returned the lever to neutral. The clutch linkage now moved correctly. The clutch disc itself was stuck to the flywheel. Years of moisture had rusted the two surfaces together. Carl Voss smiled from beside his truck. "Engine runs, tractor doesn't." Luke ignored him. He shut the engine down and selected first gear while the transmission was still. Then he pressed the clutch pedal fully and secured it with a short strap. Anna stepped closer. "What are you doing?" "Starting it in gear." Dean immediately shook his head. "Not with people around it." Luke pointed toward the open lane leading to the orchard road. No one stands in front, behind, or beside the wheels. Ray ordered the remaining buyers to move back. Luke checked the brakes. The right pedal resisted normally. The left felt soft. That meant he could not rely on both brakes to stop the machine evenly. He made sure the throttle was nearly closed and left one hand close to the ignition switch. If the tractor moved too quickly, he would cut the spark. Luke pressed the starter. The engine turned. Because the tractor was in gear, the rear wheels began moving immediately. The machine rolled forward several inches. Then the engine fired. The tractor lurched. Luke released the starter and grabbed the steering wheel. It moved across the yard at walking speed. The clutch pedal remained pressed down, but the rusted disc still transferred power. Luke reduced the throttle. The tractor slowed but continued pulling. He needed to place a short load through the drivetrain to break the disc free. He pressed the right brake carefully. The tractor turned toward the fence. Luke released it and corrected the steering. The left brake was too weak to balance the turn. He could not shock the clutch with the brake safely. The open lane narrowed ahead. Ray called from behind him, "Running out of room." Luke looked at the throttle lever. He lowered the engine speed until the tractor almost stalled. Then he opened it quickly. The drivetrain jerked. The clutch remained stuck. He repeated the movement. Low speed. Brief acceleration. Release. On the third attempt, a sharp crack came from beneath the seat. The engine suddenly raced. The tractor stopped pulling. Luke reduced the throttle immediately and moved the gear lever into neutral. The lever came out without resistance. He released the clutch pedal. The tractor remained still while the engine continued running. "The disc broke free," Dean said. Luke removed the strap and pressed the pedal several times. Then he selected first gear again. No grinding. He released the clutch slowly. The tractor moved forward smoothly. The crowd stepped aside as Luke drove a slow circle around the yard. The steering had too much play, but it responded. The right brake worked. The left brake needed repair. The temperature gauge stayed below the danger zone, and the shortened radiator hose remained dry. Ray walked toward the gate and opened it. "You got it running before sunset," he said. "Can you get it home before dark?" Luke looked at the road. The Bennett orchard was less than 3 miles away. Mostly level. Little traffic. The tractor could make the trip if he moved slowly and stopped often. Anna brought the pickup around and switched on its hazard lights. "I'll follow you." Dean walked beside the tractor for several yards. "The left brake must be repaired before you use it on the hillside." "I know. And the ignition timing still needs to be set with a light." "I know. The cooling system needs more than a shortened hose." "I know." Dean stopped walking. "You are not going to argue with me?" Luke looked ahead. "You are right about those problems." That answer left Dean quiet. Luke shifted into first gear. The tractor crossed the gate under its own power. Behind him, Carl stood beside the trailer he had planned to use for parts. Ray removed the sign from the steering wheel. "New parts. Still won't run." He handed it to Anna through the pickup window. "You may want this." She placed it on the passenger seat. The old red tractor rolled onto the road as the last orange light faded behind the orchard. The crowd had laughed when Luke bought it. By sunset, the engine was running. By darkness, it was on its way home. But starting the tractor had only proven Luke's diagnosis. The real test waited between the apple trees, where the machine would have to work long enough to save the crop. Luke reached home after dark. The trip from the auction yard took nearly an hour. He kept the tractor in first gear while Anna followed in the pickup with the hazard lights flashing. Every few minutes, Luke stopped to inspect the radiator hose. The shortened hose held. Oil pressure remained steady. The engine missed occasionally, but it never backfired. When the tractor entered the Bennett orchard, Luke did not drive it directly to the sprayer. The left brake was still weak, and the ignition timing had only been set closely enough to make the engine run. The machine needed more work before it could enter the hillside rows. At sunrise, Luke began with the cooling system. He replaced the damaged upper hose with one from their broken tractor, trimming it to fit. Then he flushed rust-colored water from the radiator until the flow became clearer. Next, he changed the engine oil. The old oil came out dark and thin, but no large metal fragments appeared in the drain pan. That was a good sign. He cleaned the fuel bowl, tightened the carburetor fittings, and secured the tank cap loosely until he could clear the blocked vent properly. The left brake required most of the morning. Luke removed the inspection cover and found a rusted linkage that moved only part way. The return spring had weakened, and old grease had hardened around the pivot. He cleaned the mechanism, replaced the spring, and adjusted the rod until both brake pedals moved through the same distance. Anna watched him test the wheels. "Is it safe now?" "Safer." "That is not the same answer." Luke lowered the tractor from the jack. "I still need to test it under load." He started the engine and allowed it to warm. Then he connected an old timing light, borrowed from Mr. Avery. The white mark on the crankshaft pulley appeared several degrees away from the correct position. Luke loosened the distributor clamp and turned the housing slowly. The timing mark moved into place. The engine immediately became smoother. He tightened the clamp and increased the throttle. As the speed rose, the timing mark advanced slightly. The distributor mechanism was working. By noon, the tractor could start, steer, shift, and stop. Now it had to power the orchard sprayer. The sprayer sat beside the barn with its 200-gallon tank half full of water for testing. A power takeoff shaft connected its pump to the tractor. Luke inspected the shaft guard, universal joints, and locking pin before attaching it. He did not want anyone near the rotating equipment once the system started. Anna stood beside the control valve. "You stay clear of the shaft," Luke said. "I know, and if the pump shakes or the hose jumps, do not grab anything. Shut the tractor down first." Luke nodded. He climbed into the seat and started the engine. The old four-cylinder fired after 2 rotations. Luke let it idle, then engaged the power takeoff slowly. The sprayer pump began turning. At first, the pressure gauge did not move. Then the needle rose. 10 pounds. 20. 30. Water began circulating through the return hose. Luke increased the throttle. The pump pressure climbed toward the level needed for spraying the orchard. Then the tractor engine lost speed. The exhaust darkened. The pump pressure dropped. Luke disengaged the power takeoff before the engine stalled. Anna looked at the gauge. "Is the pump too large? It worked with our other tractor." "Then the engine is weak?" "Maybe." Luke restarted the test. Without the sprayer engaged, the engine accelerated normally. When he applied the load, the speed fell again. This time, Luke watched the carburetor linkage. The throttle lever on the dashboard remained in place, but the carburetor did not open farther as the engine slowed. The governor should have sensed the loss of speed and increased the throttle automatically. It did not. Luke shut down the engine and examined the governor linkage. A thin rod connected the governor arm to the carburetor. Rust covered both joints. One pivot moved reluctantly, and the rod had been adjusted so short that the throttle could not open fully. The engine was not necessarily too weak. It was being prevented from responding to the load. Luke disconnected the rod and moved the governor arm by hand. It resisted, then returned slowly. He cleaned the pivot and added a few drops of oil. After several minutes of working the arm back and forth, the internal spring began pulling it smoothly. Then he lengthened the linkage slightly. Anna looked toward the northern orchard. More damaged leaves had appeared overnight. "How long will this take? I need the governor to open the throttle without letting the engine race. Can you adjust it while it runs?" "Carefully." Luke reconnected the linkage and restarted the tractor. He engaged the sprayer again. The pump pressure rose. The engine speed began falling under load. This time, the governor arm moved. The carburetor opened farther. The engine recovered. Luke watched the pressure gauge. 40 pounds. 50. 60. The needle held steady. The tractor maintained its speed. Anna opened one spray valve. Water rushed through the nozzles in a wide mist. The engine loaded harder but did not slow. Luke allowed the system to run for several minutes while checking the temperature and oil pressure. Both remained safe. The tractor could power the sprayer. They drained the test water and filled the tank with the treatment mixture they had prepared according to the orchard plan. Anna checked the wind. Light and steady. Good enough to begin. Luke drove toward the northern block. The old tractor fit between the narrow rows with only a few feet of clearance on each side. Branches brushed the faded hood as he entered the orchard. Anna followed on foot at a safe distance, watching the spray pattern. Luke engaged the power takeoff. The pump began working. Mist spread evenly across the first row of trees. For the first 100 yards, the tractor held a steady speed. Then the engine surged. The governor opened the throttle too far, corrected, then opened it again. The tractor moved unevenly between the trees. Luke disengaged the sprayer and stopped. The linkage adjustment was too loose. Under changing load, the governor overcorrected. He shortened the rod by half a turn. On the next test, the engine responded more smoothly. The speed dropped slightly when the pump loaded, then recovered without surging. Luke continued. Row by row, the faded red tractor carried the sprayer through the orchard. The job demanded more than simply keeping the engine alive. Luke had to maintain the correct speed so the trees received an even application. Too fast, and sections would be missed. Too slow, and the mixture would be wasted before the entire orchard was covered. He watched the pressure gauge. Anna checked the nozzles whenever he turned at the end of a row. The machine kept working. Near the middle of the northern block, the engine began to miss. Luke reduced the throttle and stopped. Fuel still filled the sediment bowl. The temperature remained normal. He opened the distributor cap. A thin film of oil had appeared near the points. The old distributor shaft seal was allowing lubricant into the housing, weakening the electrical contact. Luke wiped the points clean and checked the gap. Then he restarted the engine. The mist disappeared. "That seal will need replacing," Anna said. "Yes. Today. Not if the points stay dry." They continued spraying. By late afternoon, the northern block was complete. The insects had already damaged part of the new growth, but the treatment had reached the trees before they spread through the entire orchard. 2 more sections remained. Dark clouds were building beyond the ridge. Rain would wash away a fresh treatment if it arrived too soon. Luke refilled the sprayer and checked the tractor. Oil pressure steady. Coolant level safe. Fuel sufficient. Distributor points dry. Governor linkage secure. Anna looked toward the southern rows. "Can it finish?" Luke rested one hand on the faded hood. The engine had started at the auction. It had driven home. It had powered the pump. But it had not yet completed the work that justified every dollar he had risked. "We keep going while the machine keeps answering correctly." Luke climbed into the seat. The tractor entered the next row as the sunlight began fading behind the apple trees. At the auction, the crowd had been impressed because the engine made noise. Here, no one was watching. The only thing that mattered was whether it could keep working until the last tree was protected. Luke entered the southern block as the wind began to change. The leaves turned their pale undersides toward the sky. Dark clouds had crossed the ridge, and the air carried the cold smell that came before rain. 2 orchard sections remained. Anna checked the spray gauge from the end of the row. "Pressure is steady." Luke nodded and kept the tractor in low gear. The engine held its speed while the sprayer pump worked behind it. The repaired governor linkage responded each time the load changed, opening the throttle just enough to recover without surging. The first row passed cleanly, then the second. By the 4th row, the tractor had been working under load for nearly 3 hours. Luke watched the temperature needle move higher, still safe. Oil pressure remained steady. He continued. Halfway through the next row, the spray pressure began to fall. 60 pounds, 50, then 40. Luke looked back. The engine speed had not changed. The problem was in the sprayer. He disengaged the power takeoff and stopped between the trees. Anna opened the pump screen. A thick layer of leaf fragments and old sediment covered the mesh. The tank had been cleaned, but years of residue remained in the bottom and had been shaken loose during the work. Luke rinsed the screen with clean water. Thunder rolled beyond the orchard. "How much time?" Anna asked. "Maybe an hour." "And how much orchard?" 7 rows here, then the west block." Anna looked toward the clouds. "We may not finish both." Luke reinstalled the screen. "We finished the section with the worst damage first." They restarted. The pressure returned immediately. Luke completed the southern rows while the first drops struck the tractor hood. The rain was light, not enough to wash the treatment away yet. They moved to the west block. Only 5 rows remained. Luke refilled the sprayer with the last prepared mixture. There would be no time to make more before the storm. He checked the tractor quickly. Fuel level low but sufficient. Coolant safe. Distributor points dry. Governor linkage secure. He entered the first western row. The rain increased. Anna walked beside the trees, watching whether the spray still reached the inner leaves. "It is starting to drift," she called. The wind was pushing the mist sideways. Luke reduced the pressure slightly and lowered the engine speed. The droplets became larger and less likely to blow away. The coverage was not perfect, it was still usable. They completed the first row, then the second. At the end of the third, the engine began to hesitate. One short miss. Then another. Luke looked at the fuel bowl. It was almost empty. The tank still held gasoline, but fuel was entering slowly again. He opened the cap fully. No change. The screen beneath the tank had likely collected more rust. Luke shut down the engine. Rain struck the hood hard enough to run in thin streams along the faded paint. Anna looked at the remaining rows. "Can you clean it here?" "Yes." "How long?" 5 minutes if the valve closes." He shut the fuel valve and removed the sediment bowl. Rust flakes covered the screen. Luke cleaned them away with gasoline from a small jar, then inspected the tank outlet. More debris sat inside the fitting. He cleared it with a thin piece of wire. Fuel began flowing strongly. Anna held the bowl while Luke reassembled it. The rain became heavier. By the time he restarted the engine, both of them were soaked. The tractor fired quickly. Luke engaged the sprayer. Pressure climbed. They entered the fourth row. Water ran down the dashboard and dripped from the edge of the steering wheel. Luke wiped his eyes with one sleeve and kept the tractor centered between the trees. The engine continued pulling. At the final turn, the temperature needle moved close to the danger zone. Luke stopped. Mud and shredded leaves had collected across the radiator screen. The fan could not draw enough air. Anna looked toward the last row. "Can it make one more pass?" "Not like this." Luke shut down the engine. They cleaned the screen by hand, pulling wet leaves from the fins. The radiator was hot, but no coolant had escaped. He waited until the temperature dropped. The final row stood less than 50 yards away. The rain was now heavy enough to reduce visibility through the orchard. Anna looked at the treated leaves behind them. "If we wait, the remaining section will be exposed. If we overheat the engine, we lose the tractor." She nodded. The decision was clear. They waited another 3 minutes. Then Luke restarted. Oil pressure rose. The temperature needle remained high but stable. He engaged the sprayer one final time. The tractor entered the last row. The pump loaded the engine. The governor opened the throttle. The old four-cylinder settled into a steady rhythm. Luke drove slowly enough for the mist to reach both sides of the trees. Anna walked behind the sprayer, checking the pattern. "Coverage is holding," she called. Halfway down the row, the engine missed once. Luke kept his hand near the throttle. The rhythm returned. The tractor continued. At the end of the row, Luke disengaged the pump and raised the engine speed briefly to clear the cylinders. Then he turned toward the barn. The final trees had been treated. The rain became a full storm before they reached the yard. Luke parked beneath the equipment shed and shut down the engine. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Rain hammered the roof. Water ran from their clothes and formed dark pools on the floor. Anna looked back toward the orchard. "Will the treatment hold? Some of it may wash off. How much? I don't know." The rain had arrived too soon for perfect results, but every damaged section had received treatment before the storm. They had given the trees a chance. Luke opened the tractor hood. The radiator screen was clogged again. The fuel system still needed a complete cleaning. The distributor seal still leaked oil toward the points. The machine had not become dependable in one day. It had simply worked long enough to finish the urgent job. Anna touched the faded red fender. At the auction, everyone thought the victory was making its start. Luke looked toward the orchard through the rain. That was only the first problem. The real victory had happened in the final row, with no crowd watching and no one left to impress. The tractor had stayed alive long enough to protect the trees. 2 weeks after the storm, the damaged leaves had stopped spreading. Some of the youngest fruit had been lost, and several branches remained weak. But most of the orchard continued growing. The treatment had held well enough. The Bennett crop would be smaller than expected. It would still be worth harvesting. Luke continued repairing the red tractor after the urgent work was finished. He removed the fuel tank and flushed out the remaining rust. He replaced the leaking distributor seal, installed a new radiator hose, and cleaned the cooling passages again. Then he adjusted the ignition with a timing light under normal operating speed. The mark on the pulley settled exactly where it belonged. The engine became smoother. Starting no longer required repeated attempts. With a small amount of choke, it fired after only a few rotations. The tractor was still old. Its steering had play. The paint remained faded, and the seat needed replacing. But it had become dependable. On Saturday morning, Anna asked Luke to pull a wagon of early apples into town. The farmer's market stood beside the same auction yard where he had bought the tractor. Luke connected the wagon and checked the load. 20 crates, more weight than the tractor had carried since its repair. He started the engine. The 4 cylinders settled into a steady rhythm. Then he drove toward town. People noticed the tractor before Luke reached the market. The old red machine passed the auction entrance with the loaded wagon behind it. Dust covered the tires, and fresh scratches marked the drawbar from weeks of orchard work. Carl Voss was standing beside a trailer when he recognized it. "That's the tractor from the auction." Several buyers turned. Ray Dalton walked out of the office and watched Luke park near the market stalls. Dean Mercer arrived a few minutes later. He stopped beside the wagon and looked at the crates. "You used it for the orchard?" "Every section," Luke said. "Under sprayer load?" "Yes." Dean placed one hand near the hood. The engine was warm but not overheating. Its idle remained even. "You changed the distributor?" "No." "Carburetor?" "No." "Engine work?" "No." Dean looked toward the ignition system. "What did it finally need?" Luke pointed to the distributor. It had been installed on the exhaust stroke. Then he pointed toward the plug wires. 2 wires were crossed. The choke? Stuck nearly closed. And the fuel cap? Blocked vent. Carl shook his head. "All small problems." "Small enough separately," Luke said. Together, they kept the engine from running. Ray approached with the old auction sign in his hand. Anna had returned it to him after they left the yard. "New parts. Still won't run. I thought you might want this," Ray said. Luke took the sign. Several people gathered around the tractor. They had seen the machine backfire through the carburetor. They had watched Luke spend nearly all his money while experienced men warned him to stop. Now the same tractor had pulled a loaded wagon into town. Dean looked beneath the distributor cap. "You were right about the stroke." Luke said nothing. Dean continued. "I aligned the timing mark, but I did not confirm compression on number 1. The admission quieted the group. Carl looked at him. "So the tractor was never broken?" Dean shook his head. "It was broken." He pointed toward the carburetor and fuel system. "But not in the way we thought." Luke nodded. That was the truth. The machine had contained real faults. The mistake had been assuming that new parts ruled out installation errors. Dean closed the hood. "I'll give you $1,600 for it." Luke looked at him. The offer was more than 3 times what he had paid. It could cover the transmission parts for their original tractor. It could pay several orchard bills and replace damaged sprayer hoses. Anna stood beside the apple wagon but did not speak. Dean continued. "You know what still needs work? Steering box, rear tires, seat, generator wiring." "I know. You could sell this one and repair your own tractor properly." Luke looked at the red machine. Their original tractor might eventually return to service, but the orchard still needed a second machine. The sprayer, wagons, and mowing equipment could not wait every time one tractor failed. More importantly, the red tractor had proven itself under real load. "No," Luke said. Dean raised the offer. $1,800. "It isn't for sale." Carl laughed. "You bought it for $475. I bought it because we needed a tractor. And now you can make a profit." Luke looked toward the crates on the wagon. "The profit is behind it." The apples had survived because the tractor had powered the sprayer in time. Selling it would turn the machine into money. Keeping it allowed the orchard to keep producing money. Dean studied Luke for a moment. Then he nodded. "That is fair." He did not increase the offer again. Ray looked at the old sign. "You should hang that on the front." Luke shook his head. "People might think it still doesn't run." Ray smiled. "Anyone who hears it will know better." Luke placed the sign beneath the wagon seat. Later that afternoon, the apple crates were empty. The tractor started on the first attempt. As Luke drove away, the same people who had laughed at the auction watched the red machine pull the empty wagon toward home. No one applauded. No one needed to. The engine's steady rhythm said enough. At sunset on the day of the auction, Luke had proved the tractor could run. Now he had proved it could work. By harvest, the red tractor had become part of the Bennett orchard. It pulled apple wagons, powered the sprayer, and carried pruning tools between the rows. Luke continued repairing small problems as they appeared, but the engine no longer backfired or refused to start. The ignition timing stayed steady. The carburetor stopped flooding. The fuel tank could breathe, and the 4 cylinders fired in the correct order. One evening, Luke parked the tractor beside the workshop after hauling the final apple crates from the west block. Anna was sorting the remaining fruit near the barn. "You still have the auction sign?" she asked. Luke pointed toward the wall above his workbench. "New parts. Still won't run." Beside it hung the first firing order diagram he had drawn at the auction. 4 numbers circled the distributor cap. 12342. Anna studied them. The sign blamed the parts. Everyone did. But the new parts worked. Luke nodded. The carburetor delivered fuel. The plugs made spark. The cylinders had compression. Then why did so many people miss the problem? They checked whether each part worked. Luke looked toward the tractor. They did not check whether the parts worked together. The distributor had been installed with the number 1 piston at the top of its exhaust stroke. The pulley mark had been correct, but the engine cycle had been wrong. Then 2 plug wires had been crossed. The choke had remained partly closed. The blocked tank vent had restricted fuel after the engine began running. Each mistake created another symptom. The backfire suggested a valve problem. The wet plug suggested too much fuel. The repeated failure made the new parts appear defective. But replacing more parts would never have corrected the sequence. The following spring, Dean Mercer returned to the orchard. He found Luke using the red tractor to pull a mower beneath the apple trees. The engine held a steady speed as the governor responded to the changing load. Dean waited until Luke stopped near the barn. "Still running well?" "Better than when I bought it." Dean examined the distributor. "You ever replace it?" "No." "The carburetor?" "No." Dean smiled faintly. "I suppose I should stop asking." Luke shut down the engine. The tractor stopped cleanly. Dean looked toward the sign above the workbench. "I have thought about that machine more than I should." "Why?" "Because I had everything I needed to diagnose it." Luke waited. "I saw the timing mark," Dean continued. "I saw spark. I saw wet plugs. When it backfired, I assumed the problem was deeper. You had evidence. I had pieces of evidence." Dean looked at the firing order diagram. "You arranged them better." Luke shook his head. "I listened to what did not fit. A damaged valve could cause a backfire. But it did not explain why the distributor showed fresh tool marks. A bad carburetor could flood the engine, but it did not explain why the spark occurred while the intake valve was open. The engine had been giving clues. The mistake was treating every clue as a separate failure. Dean held out a small timing light. "This belonged to my father. I have another one at the shop." Luke accepted it. "You do not have to give me this." "I know." Dean looked at the tractor. "Call it payment for reminding me to confirm the compression stroke." After he left, Luke hung the timing light beneath the auction sign. The tractor still looked old. Its paint was faded, the seat remained patched, and rust marked the edges of the hood. Luke had no plans to make it look new. He cared that it started safely, stopped correctly, and worked when the orchard needed it. That summer, the Bennett family harvested enough apples to repair their original tractor's transmission. For the first time in years, the farm had 2 working machines. Anna suggested selling the red tractor. Luke considered it. They could have earned far more than the auction price. But the orchard had narrow rows, steep turns, and work that could not stop whenever one machine failed. The red tractor had already proven its value. It stayed. On cool mornings, Luke followed the same starting routine. Fuel valve open, transmission in neutral, a small amount of choke, ignition on, starter engaged. The engine turned twice. Then the cylinders fired in sequence. 1, 3, 4, 2. The sound moved through the orchard like a lesson repeated in steel. At the auction, everyone had believed the tractor needed another replacement part. Luke had discovered something simpler. Nothing important had been missing. The engine had fuel. It had spark. It had compression. What it lacked was the correct moment for all 3 to meet. They laughed when Luke bought the tractor. By sunset it was running, and long after the crowd stopped watching, it kept the orchard alive, because one boy understood that working parts were useless until they worked in the right order.